I had exactly 47 minutes to decide whether to walk out of that building forever or burn it down from the inside. Not literally. I'm not that kind of person. But when you spent 11 years building something real, something that worked, something that mattered, and you come back from a business trip to find your team of 8 has been relocated to a sub-basement that smells like rust and standing water, you start doing a different kind of math. My name is Maren Solis. I was the Director of Systems Integration at Callaway Infrastructure Partners, a mid-sized civil engineering firm based in Denver, Colorado. We specialized in federal and municipal contracts, water treatment facilities, transportation networks, emergency response grid upgrades. Not glamorous, but essential. The kind of work that, if done poorly, costs lives. My team understood that. Every single one of them. I want you to understand what I came back to before I tell you what I did about it. I had been in Phoenix for a 9-day contract negotiation. A $31 million water infrastructure deal for Maricopa County. I'd closed it. Not only that, I'd reduced the liability exposure by 14% by restructuring 2 subclauses that our legal team had missed. My boss, our division VP, sent me a 3-word text, "Nicely done, Maren." I saved that text. Later, I would use it. The Monday I returned, I walked through the main lobby of our building, a converted industrial space in Denver's Rhino District, all exposed brick and polished concrete, and I noticed something immediately. The 3rd floor, where my team occupied a suite of 8 workstations near the window wall overlooking the mountains, was being used for something else. New furniture, a standing desk with a branded monitor, a ring light, a whiteboard covered in phrases like velocity architecture and human-centric throughput. Someone had redecorated. Over a weekend. I found my team in sublevel 2. There was no signage directing me there. I had to ask Marcus from facilities, who looked at the floor when he answered. "They moved your people this morning," he said quietly. "Last Friday, actually." "I'm sorry, Maren. Sublevel 2 is not an office." It was a utility corridor that had been hastily staged with folding tables and mismatched chairs. The ventilation was a single ceiling duct from the HVAC overflow system. The lighting was 2 rows of industrial fluorescents, one of which flickered at irregular intervals. My team of 8 brilliant, disciplined, meticulous engineers sat there amid their equipment, which had been transported without care. I could see a cracked monitor stand, a cable management tray just laying on the floor. My lead engineer, Petra Okafor, looked up when I entered. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just held my gaze. In 11 years, I had learned to read Petra's silences the way other people read spreadsheets. What I read in that moment was, I stayed. I didn't leave. "But you need to explain yourself." "When did this happen?" I asked. "Thursday afternoon," she said. "Gareth came down with 2 people from operations. Said the 3rd floor suite was being reassigned to support a new strategic initiative. We had 2 hours to pack. Gareth Wills, our new division VP, 8 months into the role. He had replaced Sandrachin, who retired after 16 years and who had built our division from 11 people to 43. Sandra had understood what we did. Gareth understood PowerPoint. "Who's on the 3rd floor?" I asked. "His name is Crispin Lowell," said my systems architect, Deo. Gareth introduced him at an all-hands last Tuesday. He's a Deo paused, choosing his words with care, a transformation strategist. I walked back upstairs. Crispin Lowell was 31 years old. He had a master's degree in organizational behavior from a school I had to look up. His LinkedIn listed 5 companies in 7 years. Each entry included phrases like led cultural pivot and architected innovation framework. His desk, my former desk, behind a glass wall that used to belong to my entire team, was covered in branded merchandise from a productivity consultancy he had apparently founded and then shuttered. A signed copy of a business book he had co-authored sat on the corner. The title included the word velocity. Gareth was beside him when I walked in. They were looking at a slide deck together, laughing at something. "Maren," Gareth said, in the tone of a man who knows he's done something and is hoping charm will paper over it. "How is Phoenix? We heard you closed it." "I did," I said. "I came back to find my team in sublevel 2. Temporary," he said immediately. while we reconfigure the floor plan to support the new initiative. You'll understand once Crispin walks you through his framework. It's genuinely going to transform the way this division operates." Crispin extended his hand. "Marin Solis, I've heard a lot about your team's work. I'm excited to build on it." I shook his hand. I said nothing. I put the phone in my pocket and walked back to sublevel 2. Here is what I knew in that moment. Standing in the elevator descending to a basement that smelled like pipe insulation and old water, that Gareth did not. I had been preparing for this possibility for 4 months. Not the basement specifically, but the direction. I had watched Gareth's tenure unfold with the patience of someone who has spent a career reading systems. He had arrived with 3 priorities: optics, optics, and optics. He canceled our weekly technical briefings because they were too granular. He started requiring that project updates be formatted as visual one-pagers rather than technical summaries because the executive team found detailed reports dense. He had begun quietly redirecting budget line items, training funds, conference allocations, software licenses, toward a rebranding effort for the division's internal identity. He gave the division a new name. We used to be systems integration. Now we were infrastructure innovation. Sandra had warned me in her last week over lunch. "I tried to hire someone from inside the organization," she'd said. I was overruled. "Watch your back, Marin." Not because Gareth is malicious. Because he's a child who doesn't know what he doesn't know, and those are sometimes more dangerous. So I had started building quietly. I documented everything. I maintained a private log stored not on company servers of every project my team completed, every deadline met, every cost saved, every risk mitigated. I cross-referenced each entry with the contract language it supported, the regulatory compliance it addressed, the federal oversight requirements it satisfied. I began reaching out to old contacts, not to look for work, not immediately, but to maintain the threads. One of those threads was a woman named Dr. Constance Abra. Constance was the Deputy Director of Infrastructure Planning at the Western Regional Coordination Office, a federal agency that, among other things, managed oversight relationships with firms like Callaway on federally funded contracts. She and I had worked together years earlier when I was a project engineer and she was a federal inspector who had the rare quality of understanding both the technical and the human side of infrastructure work. We had stayed in touch. Occasional emails. A lunch when she passed through Denver. She was brilliant, careful, and absolutely without patience for theater. When I reached out to her in the early weeks of Gareth's tenure, I framed it as a professional reconnection. By the time the basement happened, it had become something more. I did not tell my team any of this on that first day back. What I told them was this: keep doing your work. Maintain the standard. Document everything you do, every communication you receive, every instruction you're given. Keep it somewhere safe, not on company servers. I need 3 weeks. Petra looked at me for a long moment. 3 weeks for what? Trust, I said. That's all I'm asking for right now. She held my gaze. Then she nodded once and turned back to her screen. That was a Tuesday. By Wednesday, I had scheduled a lunch with Constance for the following Monday. By Thursday, I had made contact with an attorney named Yusuf Adebanjo, a former colleague who had moved into labor and employment law after a decade in civil litigation. I told him I might need him. He told me to send whatever I had. I sent him a 200-page document I had been assembling for months. By Friday, Gareth had circulated a company-wide email announcing a transformation roadshow, a series of all-hands presentations led by Crispin Lowell, beginning the following week, designed to align all team members with the division's new velocity architecture. My team's response to this email was, professionally, silence. Personally, I know at least 2 of them rewrote their resumes that weekend. I did not blame them. Here is what I learned about Crispin Lowell that I want to share with you now because it matters to what happens next. His 5 companies in 7 years were not a story of a restless visionary chasing new challenges. They were a pattern. At each company, he arrived with executive sponsorship, always one specific executive who had been dazzled by his presentation style. He delivered an initial period of energy and buzzword-dense activity. Productivity metrics were reframed in ways that made short-term numbers look better while obscuring longer-term deterioration. The executive who had sponsored him either got promoted or moved on, typically within 18 months. After they left, the structural damage Crispin's frameworks had caused became visible. At 2 of his 5 companies, the specific divisions he had led had subsequently been dissolved or restructured. At a 3rd, there was a wrongful termination complaint, settled out of court, sealed, but findable if you knew what to look for and had the right kind of help. I knew what to look for. And I had Yusuf. None of this was illegal. None of it was even particularly unusual in a certain kind of corporate culture that rewards charisma over competence. What made it consequential in our case was one specific fact. Callaway Infrastructure Partners held 11 active federal contracts at the time of Gareth's hire of Crispin Lowell. 3 of those contracts contained performance compliance clauses that required continuity of the certified technical team named in the contract proposal. My team, by name, 8 engineers, including me, listed in Schedule B of 3 separate federal contracts as the specific personnel responsible for compliance oversight. Moving us to Sublevel 2 was, legally, not the problem. What became the problem was what happened in Week 2. Gareth, apparently emboldened by the silence from my team, made a decision I don't believe he thought through. He submitted a contract amendment request to one of our federal oversight contacts, proposing to substitute 2 members of my team, Petra and Deo, our 2 most senior engineers, with contractors sourced through a staffing firm that Crispin had a pre-existing relationship with. The amendment was framed as a resource optimization consistent with the new velocity architecture. He did not tell me. He did not consult legal. He did not, apparently, read the compliance clause in Schedule B of Federal Contract 4471W, which stated explicitly that personnel substitutions on federally certified technical teams required 60 days written notice, documented justification, and approval from the contracting officer representative, in this case, an office that reported to Constance Abra. I found out about the amendment request on a Wednesday morning through a source I will not name, who simply sent me a forwarded email with no message attached. I sat with it for 20 minutes. Then I called Yusuf. How fast can you move? I asked. On what timeline do you need? The board meets in 11 days. There was a brief pause. Send me the contract language and the amendment request. I'll have something for you by Friday. I put the phone down. Then I went upstairs, found Gareth in his office, and sat down across from him with a calm I had been training for months to maintain. Gareth, I said, I noticed a contract amendment request was submitted on 4471W. He blinked. That's part of the resource transition. Crispin's team is fully capable of, are you aware of Schedule B, Section 7 of that contract? He opened his mouth, closed it. The 60-day notice requirement, I continued. The documentation requirements. The contracting officer representative approval. The fact that unauthorized personnel substitution on a federally certified team constitutes a material breach under FAR 52.249-8. Gareth's expression did something complicated. He was not a stupid man. He was simply a man who had made decisions without reading the underlying documents. I'll have legal look at it, he said. I'd suggest you do that today, I said. And I stood up and walked back downstairs. I want to tell you about my team, because they are the reason any of this mattered. Petra Okafor had a doctorate in hydraulic systems engineering from the University of Michigan. She had turned down 3 offers from larger firms because she believed in the work we were doing at Callaway. When Gareth moved us to the basement, she said nothing to me about leaving. She said nothing to anyone. But I noticed she had stopped keeping personal items on her desk. The framed photo of her family in Lagos. Gone. The small succulent she'd had for 4 years. Gone. Those were not good signs. Deo Adeyemi, our systems architect, had designed the monitoring framework for 2 of our federal contracts from scratch. It was his work, his specific intellectual contribution, that had reduced error rates on our last 2 infrastructure installations by 22%. He had been asked, twice, to present that work at federal contractor conferences. Gareth had declined to approve the travel because it didn't fit the new optics. There were 6 others, each of them exceptional, Each of them, by the time I returned from Phoenix, quietly beginning to wonder whether the institution that had benefited from their expertise deserved their continued loyalty. My answer to that question was, not yet. But hold on. Monday came. I met Constance for lunch at a restaurant near the federal building. I brought the contract documents, the amendment request, and a summary of what had occurred over the past 8 months. I did not ask her for anything impermissible. I did not ask her to do anything other than what her job required. What I asked was whether she was aware of the pending amendment request on Contract 4471W and whether her office intended to review it against the Schedule B compliance requirements. She was not aware of it. By Tuesday morning, the Western Regional Coordination Office had issued a formal review notice to Callaway's contracting liaison, flagging the amendment request as potentially non-compliant and initiating a 30-day compliance audit covering all 3 of our Schedule B contracts. This is not revenge. This is what oversight mechanisms exist to do. Gareth received the notice at 9:14 a.m. By 9:45, he had called an emergency meeting with legal, operations, and the division CFO. I was not invited. I found out about it the same way I found out about the amendment request. Someone forwarded me an email. At 11 a.m., Gareth knocked on the door of Sublevel 2. Marin, do you have a minute? I looked at my team. They looked at me. I stood up and followed him into the hallway. I need to understand what happened with the federal review notice, he said. The contracting officer representative's office reviewed a pending amendment request and found potential compliance issues, I said. That's their job. Did you? He stopped. Started again. Did you contact them? I had lunch with an old professional contact, I said. We discussed the industry. I didn't submit the amendment request. You did. He looked at me for a long time. What do you want, Marin? And here is where I made a choice that I want to be precise about, because I think precision matters. I did not want Gareth's job. I did not want to humiliate him. I did not want a public spectacle. What I wanted was specific, documented, and entirely reasonable. I wanted my team restored to appropriate working conditions. I wanted the personnel substitution request withdrawn. I wanted a written acknowledgement from leadership that our team's work product was central to the company's federal contract compliance obligations. And I wanted a structural conversation, not with Gareth, but with the board about how this division was being managed. I want a board presentation, I said. 30 minutes. I'll bring the data. You can bring whatever you want. He agreed. I think he agreed because he believed he could still manage the optics. He could not. The board presentation was 10 days later. I had spent those 10 days preparing, with Yusuf reviewing every document, with Petra and Deo running numbers I had requested from our project management system, with 3 other members of my team building visualizations I had never planned to need but was grateful to have. I also spent those 10 days continuing to do my job. My team continued to do their jobs. From Sublevel 2, under flickering fluorescence, next to a ventilation duct that sounded like it was breathing, we delivered 2 project milestone reports on time, responded to 47 technical inquiries from federal contract administrators, and completed a risk assessment for a water treatment upgrade in Arapahoe County that our project manager later told me was the clearest technical brief I've ever received from a contractor team. I tell you this not to be impressive. I tell you this because I want you to understand the thing I believed then and believe now. The work is the argument. Everything else is just making sure the right people see it. The board met on a Thursday. Gareth presented first. His slides were well designed. Crispin's framework was presented with confidence. The productivity projections were ambitious. Several board members nodded at the velocity architecture language. Then I presented. I did not use the word velocity once. What I used were federal contract numbers, compliance clause citations, performance metrics over 5 years, a comparison of our division's deliverable quality ratings against industry benchmarks, and a precise accounting of what the compliance audit currently underway meant for the company's standing with the Western Regional Coordination Office. I also presented, on page 14 of my document, a timeline. The timeline showed, in sequence, the following: Crispin Lowell's hire date, the reallocation of training and development budget to the rebrand initiative, the relocation of my team to sublevel 2, the unauthorized amendment request, and the federal compliance notice. I let the board look at it in silence for about 30 seconds. Then I said, I want to be clear about what I am not alleging. I am not alleging that anyone in this room acted in bad faith. I am not here to assign blame. I am here to show the board what the data shows and to ask a structural question. Is this the division you intend to operate? The board chair, a woman named Harriet Bosch, who had been on the board for 9 years and who I had met exactly once before, leaned forward. What would you recommend, Miss Elise? I would recommend 3 things, I said. First, the personnel substitution request should be withdrawn immediately and voluntarily before the compliance audit concludes to preserve the company's standing with the contracting office. Second, my team should be relocated to appropriate working facilities consistent with their role in supporting active federal contracts. Third, the board should commission an independent review of resource allocation decisions within this division over the past 8 months. I did not recommend what should happen to Gareth. I did not recommend what should happen to Crispin. That was not my job. The board asked me to leave the room. Then they asked Gareth to leave the room. I sat in the hallway for 41 minutes. I know because I watched my phone. When Harriet Bosch opened the door and asked me back in, Gareth was not there. We've asked Gareth to take a temporary administrative leave while we conduct the review you've described, she said. We'd like to discuss an interim arrangement with you. What followed was a conversation I had prepared for because I had prepared for most things. By the end of it, I had agreed to serve as interim division director while the board completed their review. Not because I had engineered it, because the situation required someone who understood both the technical and the administrative dimensions of what the division did, and because I was, demonstrably, that person. The personnel substitution request was withdrawn that afternoon. The federal compliance audit was completed 6 weeks later with no findings. All 3 Schedule B contracts were renewed at their next option periods. Crispin Lowell left the company voluntarily 2 weeks after the board meeting. I never spoke to him again after that first handshake. He moved to another city and started a podcast about workplace transformation. It has several hundred subscribers. Gareth Wills was not terminated. He was reassigned to a client relations role in a different division, one without federal contract oversight responsibilities. I am told he is adequate at it. My team moved back to the 3rd floor. I had the ring light removed. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and it's the part of this story I've thought about the most. About a month after the board meeting, Petra came into my office and closed the door. She sat down across from me, in the same chair I had sat in across from Gareth. She looked at me for a long moment. How long had you been planning this? She asked. Planning is the wrong word, I said. I'd been paying attention. You knew before Phoenix. I knew the direction it was heading, I said. I didn't know the basement. She was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you tell us? And I gave her the honest answer, because if I'd told you, some of you would have left. And you had the right to leave if you wanted to. But I needed to know that when we made our stand, it was because we chose to, not because I'd recruited you into something. She thought about that. Then she said, that's either very principled or very manipulative. It might be both, I said. She nodded once. Fair enough. We went back to work. I stayed at Callaway for 3 more years as division director. We grew the federal contract portfolio from 11 to 19 active contracts. Petra became my deputy. Deo presented his error reduction framework at 2 national conferences. The rest of the team, every one of them, is still doing work that matters. The last thing I want to say is this. The basement didn't break us, but it clarified something I have tried to carry with me since, that institutional loyalty is not unconditional, and it shouldn't be. The right response to being devalued is not rage, and it is not surrender. It is documentation, patience, and the willingness to let the truth speak at the right moment, in the right room, to the right people. The most powerful thing you can bring into a boardroom is not charisma. It's evidence. And the most powerful thing you can give your team is not a promise. It's a plan. I had both. And when the moment came, I put them on page 14.